Next up, we've got another flying type wyvern, I think, or is this one considered a bird type? We have Yan Kutku. This monster has been in most of the older games as far back as I can remember. Let me double check its classification. Confirm, yes, Yan Kutku is a bird wyvern. This one being an early game target in any game it's appeared in is pretty standard. You fight it, and it's a smaller type of wyvern, but meant to be an introduction to a lot of the more difficult monsters like your Rathians and whatnot. But what is significant for Kutku is that it is usually the most memorable early game target in those older games, and being that it's been in most of the Monster Hunter titles, it sort of falls into a similar category as Dodogama as far as being an icon or mascot of the series. Everybody remembers fighting it, and it's got sort of a playful design. Because we're not factoring things like gear or whatnot, and its fight is interesting because it forces you to learn in the earlier parts of the game, I would put Kutku up here on A tier, sort of alongside Rathalos. And I think the fact that it's iconic is what's carrying it here, because overall, I like its design. I think the fight is important for teaching people how to play Monster Hunter, and it wouldn't be a Monster Hunter game without it, which is why everyone was sort of surprised to not see it in the current generation on World. But I think with Rise coming up, it's very possible we'll see it come back there, since it would be probably since Generations or Generations Ultimate where anyone has seen it. So we'll see. I like Kutku. It's a pretty memorable monster in my opinion. It deserves a high spot on the list here. Next up, moving on to the next sort of family, we have Monoblos. Monoblos, I don't remember where it debuted. It's been in pretty much all of the older games, and I think it came back in Generations? I honestly cannot remember how many games this one has been in. But Monoblos is a flying type wyvern and a cousin to Diablos, which is pretty well known by people who've played the recent games. Main difference is Monoblos has one horn and sort of resembles a Styracosaurus dinosaur in its design. Overall, I feel like Monoblos' design is average. If you're a fan of Diablos, you would probably find Monoblos to be a little less interesting. But what weighs this monster down on the list here is the fact that its moveset is very similar to Diablos. In fact, in the older games, they were almost identical in how they behaved. Both monsters you'd encounter in like desert type environments, both would burrow and try and come up at your feet or run you over. As a result, I don't think Monoblos is really that distinct. Let's see, was it in Generations Ultimate? I do know that it showed up more recently, and they sort of tweaked its moveset to make it a little more unique. According to the wiki, it did not show up in Generations. I guess the last time I would have seen it would be Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate? Okay. Well, either way, I don't want to spend too much time dissecting all the monsters here. But the fact that Monoblos is not quite as interesting to me as Diablos later on, I'm going to put it here ahead of Kezu in C tier. I'd say slightly on the lower side of average. If the monster was a bit more unique in the way it behaved, I think the fact that its design is still interesting would sort of carry it further. And maybe we'll see Monoblos come back in the later games, but for now I'm going to put it a little bit further down. Not a bad monster, but it tends to be overshadowed by Diablos. Next up in the family, we have the subspecies for Monoblos, which is white Monoblos. Kind of like the red Kezu, white Monoblos doesn't really do a whole lot differently. It focuses on attacks in the same manner, trying to think of the best way to phrase it. It still does burrowing attacks and charging attacks, but being a later target than the original version, White Monoblos is faster and stronger, but I wouldn't say that it's really that distinct. So I'm going to put it here. I'll put it ahead of Red Kezu because I think I like the white coloring better than the red. Some of the older games fell into this sort of trap with the subspecies where they were just sort of a palette swap with minor move tweaks, and they come with their own gear usually, or they'd be a higher upgrade tier to the vanilla version. But some of these ones, which I think we'll see on the list here, didn't really do a whole lot differently, which is why I think they don't deserve to be rated as high. Later on in the games, it seems like Capcom focused more on giving the subspecies or rare species or variants or whatever they were gimmicks or unique things that would set them apart and give people a reason to hunt them. But in some of these older ones, that wasn't necessarily the case. So you're going to see things like White Monoblos and Red Kezu sort of being dropped down further, in my opinion. Next up, we're going to move on to Diablos. This monster is also very iconic in the series. It's been in most of the games and was sort of redesigned and tweaked a little bit for the current generation World and Iceborne as a mid to later game target. I like Diablos. I think it's definitely more interesting than its single horn cousin, but it's also a pretty challenging fight that forces you to be very, very careful when it comes to dealing with fast targets. If you're not thinking on your toes and watching out for the tells, you will find yourself getting trampled or gored when it pops up at your feet. Design-wise and fight-wise, I put Diablos on the B tier. I think I'm going to put it above Silver Rathalos because it's less annoying to fight than Silver Rathalos for sure. The fact that Diablos has sort of been a mainstay throughout the series, and the fact that they have tweaked its moveset a little bit over the different installments to sort of keep it fresh, I think Diablos deserves an above average spot on the tier list here. I'm curious to see what people think about this one because a lot of players tend to get frustrated fighting Diablos, but I always thought its fight was interesting. It just forces you to pay attention. For its subspecies, Black Diablos. This one is interesting because most games that were either the G rank or ultimate version or higher, with some exceptions, you had Black Diablos. This one is basically a regular Diablos, or female Diablos that's in heat that turns black during mating season. And the way Black Diablos behaves is a little bit different. It's very aggressive and much faster than the regular version. It's very dangerous. This particular monster's design, I think, carries it a little bit further than White Monoblos for its counterpart. Between the fact that Black Diablos is pretty challenging and also looks cool, the design on a desert backdrop of this sort of all black and gray creature is a bit of a contrast, but I do like it. I'm going to put Black Diablos higher up on the C tier. I'm going to put it above Tsitsiyaku. Definitely doesn't fall into the sort of boring sameness that White Monoblos and Red Kezu do, in my opinion, but I don't think it's on par with its iconic nature as regular Diablos. Most people tend to be frustrated with this monster. I think it looks cool. I prefer not to fight it unless I need its bits for something, so we're going to put it in the middle of C tier here. I get the feeling our C tier is going to be heavy, but as we start getting into some of the more interesting monsters, the upper parts of the tier list are going to start coming in, I think. Move on to Basarios. Basarios showed up in the older games too, and it's related to Gravios, which is the later part of this family here. Basically, Basarios is a rock-like flying wyvern. You usually find it in volcanic areas. It burrows in the ground to sort of blend in, and it looks like a series of rocks sticking out of the ground. When you fight it, it can sort of plod towards you, and roll over and crush you if you're not careful, and it can spit fireballs. Overall, it's an early game target. sort of meant to teach the player about watching out for armored parts and learning how to use things like part breaking in order to disrupt a monster's physical resistance. I'd say Basarios is pretty neutral. I don't think it's a bad design or a bad fight. So I'm going to put Basarios below Tzitzi-Yaku and above Azurlos and Pink Rathian. Mostly because it's pretty inoffensive. There's nothing I could say I dislike about this monster. Versus some of these other ones on the list here, I can definitely say there's stuff I don't like about them. We'll put Basarios here. Its subspecies, which is Ruby Basarios, I think it's called. Yeah. This one looks different in that it has these red mineral chunks on it, and it behaves a little bit different. But overall, it's sort of in a similar situation like these other subspecies down here, where it's not terribly memorable. I think aesthetically, Ruby Basarios looks kind of neat, but its fight is almost exactly the same. So we're going to put that one down here in the quote-unquote boring subspecies row for now, until we start getting the more annoying ones that I don't like. There will be some that I'm going to put down in these lower tier lists here that may or may not be controversial. But if we move on to the adult form of Basarios, that's Gravios down here. Gravios, like its juvenile form, lives in volcanic regions and is much larger. It's flying type wyvern and is capable of getting airborne, but because it's so large and bulky, it tends to not do that. When you fight it, it has the ability to sort of wade through lava. It's unaffected by volcanic regions. It'll try and run you over, smack you with its tail, but more dangerously, it has a really focused beam of fire that it shoots out of its mouth like a laser. The Basarios gear is fire element, I believe. Or Gravios gear. Gravios and Basarios, technically, would be fire element. This one, people seem to be a bit divided on. Its movesets in the older games, I'd say prior to things like the recent Ultimate series and Generations and whatnot, tended to be a bit one note. Gravios, I think, looks cool. To me, fighting it was always a bit of a chore unless you were using guns or ranged weapons. As a result, I'm going to put Gravios at the bottom of C tier. If we were basing this on gear, I think it would probably be lower because its gear is okay. It can be purposed for a lot of different builds, but I don't think I dislike Gravios enough to drop it down to these lower tiers. Its cousin, its subspecies, I have a bit more to say on, so we'll go ahead and move on. Black Gravios, the subspecies for regular Gravios, sort of behaves kind of like Ruby Basarios. It doesn't have a different element and is encountered in the same areas, but the moveset for Black Gravios is a little bit different. It tends to be a bit more beam happy, and it will spew deadly fire everywhere. And this particular one is very annoying to fight because it's not quite as predictable as the regular Gravios. You can't just sort of stand back, dodge its lasers, and shoot it if you're using ranged weapons. Black Gravios is faster and, in my opinion, much more annoying. The problem is, while I want to rate this one super low on the tier list because of how obnoxious it is to fight, I actually like its design better than the regular one. So it's a little bit difficult for me to figure out where to put this one. If it was purely based on the fight, this thing would probably be at the bottom of D tier. But the fact that I like its design, but really don't like fighting it, versus the original, which I think its design is fine and I don't mind fighting it, I feel like I have to put Black Gravios basically in the same place. It's like they're both rated lower than these other ones, but for different reasons that cancel out. Some people will disagree with me on this. I know a lot of people don't like Black Gravios. They'd probably put it down here in F tier. If it was purely based on the fight and the fact that its gear, again, is pretty average, I would say, yeah, put it down here in F tier. But the fact that I really like the way it looks, a sort of black volcanic obsidian look, means I can't drop it all the way down to the bottom based on the rules I've set for this tier list. So I think we'll split the difference. Might be a controversial take to put black Gravios in the middle, but we're going to put it on C tier for now.